Welcome back, everyone, for our next session, United We Plan, Emergency Response Planning at Federal, State, and Local Level, a conversation between Curtis Brown and Marcy Roth. I'm so happy to introduce our speakers today. Curtis Brown, the co-founder of the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, and Marcy Roth, the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the World Institute on Disability. I ask you both to please provide a brief visual description, and then we're so excited to hear from you.
Hi, everybody. This is Marcy Roth. I'm an older disabled white woman with curly gray hair, red glasses, and I'm wearing a blue top, black jacket, and I have a Sustainable Development Goals pin on my lapel.
Hello, everyone. Curtis Brown, African-American, Black, male, middle age, wearing a gray sports jacket, blue shirt with white stripes, bald head, and black beard. Really glad to be with you all today. And I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Marcy, so great to be here, to be able to speak with you. We've known each other for quite some time. When I was a young staffer on the House Committee on Homeland Security and post-Katrina, a lot of focus on closing many of the gaps related to inclusion and accessibility. And so I was able to meet with you and work with you and learn so much from you. So it's really great to call you a friend as well as a mentor. And I know we have gone over the bio for Marcy, but it's clearly a very highly respected and influential figure in the disability inclusion world, and work that she's doing on a global level with the World Institute for Disability is exceptional, and of course appointed by President Obama to FEMA and leading the development and the setup of the Office of Disability Integration Coordination has really made a lasting impact for emergency management and disaster response, though we still have a long way to go. And we're going to talk about that and talk about the work that you're doing, some of the successes and some of the gaps and failures that we still need to work on. But my first question is just, tell us a little bit about your journey and throughout your career and life, and how you became passionate about accessibility and inclusion.
Well, thank you very much, Curtis. Thank you to Disability Rights New York. It's really a wonderful opportunity to be among friends. I will begin by saying, Curtis, yes, you and I have had many opportunities to work together, and I'm excited about the journey forward. And let me also say that early in my career, I worked with the protection and advocacy system. So back in the early 1980s, early in my disability rights career, I had the opportunity to first learn about disability rights and how to be an effective advocate. So it's particularly important to me to have the opportunity to speak with the Disability Rights New York and to be with protection and advocacy colleagues, because I'm very hopeful that the protection and advocacy systems are going to take on a much greater role in impacting the outcomes for people with disabilities before, during, and after disasters. Let me also say, in terms of how I came to this, having worked in disability rights for many, many, many years, in the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attacks in 2001. I was the Director of Advocacy and Public Policy for the National Council on Independent Living, and was contacted by New York City colleagues who were very concerned that people who live in the area around Ground Zero were unable to get their usual resources, and the decisions that were being made by emergency management were resulting in unintended consequences. Personal assistance service providers couldn't get in to provide the support that they do on a daily basis. Paratransit, other supports and services were being unnecessarily interrupted. So, that was the first that I really thought about what happens for people with disabilities in disasters. And, I was sort of taken aback, and then found myself in a role where I was being asked by the White House to provide some guidance on what could be done differently, and how people with disabilities could be immediately better served. So I will be honest and say we just started making it up because we really hadn't done much work in that space. Subsequently, over the next 21, 22 years, it has become very central to the work that I do, the work that the World Institute on Disability does, and as well, very much an important part of the work that I think all disability rights and disability justice organizations are doing, because the disproportionate impact for people with disabilities, especially multiply marginalized people with disabilities, is growing rather than the outcomes are getting worse rather than better. So that's a little bit about what brings me to where I'm at today. And in fact, I am joining you today from the United Nations, where I'm at the midpoint review of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are halfway into the 15-year plan to reduce the impact of disaster risk. And I can say to you that unfortunately, this midpoint review in the 15-year plan, it is acknowledged widely that unfortunately not much progress has been made. And for people with disabilities, there's no doubt, but that in the US and globally, we have not made the kind of progress that we need to make. So I will turn back to you, Curtis, and look forward to the next parts of our conversation.
Yes, thank you very much, Marcy. And I was going to ask you, there's a little bit of background noise. I figured you were maybe in travel or doing the good work that you're working on. And so I appreciate you providing that context. And yes, still a long way to go on the international and domestic level for accessibility and inclusion, the research and the lived experience of people with disabilities definitely demonstrate and indicate that in multiple disasters. As you mentioned, 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, all the wildfires, these disasters are becoming more frequent and severe. And so this has to really be a priority. And so this question is really just, People with disabilities, clearly disproportionately impacted during disasters and natural hazards. And the findings indicate that inadequate planning and accommodations. What measures can be taken to improve emergency preparedness and ensure the safety and well-being of individuals with disabilities during disasters?
So this is Marcy, and I was in a very quiet place until right as we started. I'm hoping that the background noise is not distracting. I could try and go someplace different. Let me say that first and foremost, there's a saying in the disability community, nothing about us without us. And we've actually even sort of ended that to very simply, nothing without us. So, one of the most important measures that needs to be taken to improve preparedness and improve outcomes for the whole community is for us to be not only at the table, but our input as people with disabilities needs to be centered. We need to be provided with the accommodations that we need in order to fully participate at the local, state, national, and global levels. And we need to really shift the paradigm that many people think is a need to plan for us rather than with us. And when we have access, when we have the physical access, the access to programs, and when we are able to access equally effective communication, we are not only able to participate, but not only taking our own personal protective measures, but we become assets to the whole community. Many of us have a lot of experience in problem solving as people with disabilities. We certainly have opportunities to solve confounding problems. And so we are particularly valuable at the table. And so again, nothing without us before, during, and after disasters.
That's great. This is Curtis, and we just recently, in the last week or so, here domestically, ended the public health emergency related to COVID-19, and clearly it was a grueling disaster. We lost many lives, disproportionate impacts during COVID-19. And I think we really need to reflect on lessons learned in preparation for future disasters and future public health emergencies. What in your perspective are some of the key lessons learned, both successes and gaps as it relates to COVID-19? And again, I think there's a lot there. It was especially on the state, federal, local level, intergovernmental affairs, different disciplines, public health, emergency management. But what's your perspective on that?
Well, let me begin by saying I'm not sure that there have been any lessons learned. I think there have been many opportunities to observe lessons, but let's begin by saying the public health emergency, although the government says it's over, is nowhere near over. In fact, I've been wearing a mask here at the UN almost every moment, except while I'm here speaking with you, because as a person who is immunocompromised and as a person who has already had COVID a couple of times and has some of the lingering impacts of that, it's been made very clear to me that I should do all I can to avoid getting it again. We are still losing hundreds of people every day to COVID in the US. And the I think you and I, Curtis, and maybe others who are on the line, understand the criteria that's used to determine the end of a public health emergency or a declared disaster. And at the same time, I think there's been a huge missed opportunity in explaining to the general public that that doesn't mean that COVID has ended. All that means is the states have determined that they have no longer exceeded their capacity to meet the needs of the people in their state. I don't know whether that's true or not, but the ending of a public health emergency is really a misnomer. And let me say that for people with disabilities, COVID has been disproportionately devastating in many ways. And, the concurrent government commitment to equity, which is admirable, has also created some real confusion around the obligations that the federal, state, and local governments have to meet their obligations under the Rehabilitation Act, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, under the Stafford Act, under other civil rights laws. And unfortunately, the impact of that has been devastating for people with disabilities. The public health emergency and the Health and Human Services, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid use of waivers has resulted in the institutionalization of people with disabilities, the flexibilities of the 1135, Section 1135 of the Social Security Act waivers have enabled the delay or even absence of collecting key information that would result in ensuring that people with disabilities are not institutionalized, or if they are institutionalized, that they are not lost in the system. And unfortunately, we have been unsuccessful in preventing the tragic loss of life, both in institutional settings, nursing homes, long-term care facilities, group homes, carceral facilities, psychiatric hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. There's also been disproportionate impact for people with disabilities in the community who've been denied access to the personal protective equipment that they need in order to maintain their health, their safety, and their independence. The care and personal assistance that people require has been impacted, and concurrently, there has been a failure to effectively monitor and enforce the laws that should prevent institutionalization, should provide the requirement that the laws are in fact enforced. And, here we are 3 years later, 200,000 or more people with disabilities died in institutions, long-term care facilities. People will say, well, we're talking about older people. We're talking about people who are identified as, fragile or frail or having underlying conditions, people with comorbidities. But the fact of the matter is, you don't go to a nursing home because you're old or because you're fragile or because you go because you have a disability and we have not successfully prevented the institutionalization of people with disabilities and disasters. So, lesson observed, without a doubt. Lesson learned, we shall see.
And that is the unfortunate reality of multiple disasters that we really don't collectively, the organizations and entities responsible do not take action to close the gaps, and we come to see those again. And so I really appreciate that perspective and that data that you provided and examples you provided. The next question is somewhat related, looking at what's the role of policymakers and legislators at every level of government. I know you've had an opportunity on a couple of occasions to speak to Congress about the role of the federal government, federal agencies that are responsible for emergency management and disasters. What needs to be advanced to close these gaps and to build resilience and focus on the needs of people with disabilities during disasters?
So thanks for that question. And yes, you and I have been witnesses together. We've been, you were working in a staff position a couple of times when I was testifying. Recently there's been more information presented by the National Council on Disability. I had the opportunity to speak to that very recently. And I am frankly perplexed that we continue to see virtually no effort to monitor and enforce the use of billions and billions and billions of taxpayer dollars that have been required for 50 years to be spent in compliance with the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, 50 years. It is entirely shocking to me that the federal government is doing virtually nothing to ensure that those billions of dollars are being appropriately spent. There seems to be an ongoing misunderstanding. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, well, the states are telling us that, they just, they aren't going to do it. They can't do it. They won't do it. They don't have the resources to do it. But the moment one slim dollar of federal money reaches their hands, they've taken on the obligation to ensure that they are complying with the law. And if they sub-grant those funds, neither the federal government nor the state government loses their obligation. They are not off the hook. And, whether it's government or non-government, any of those dollars that are being spent must be spent in compliance with the law. And I continue to be baffled by the lack of enforcement. And recently, I heard there were folks saying, well, we need to go back to Congress and we need Congress to appropriate more funds for compliance with the law. Now, surely it would be great if there were more funds to do that, but it is not an option to enforce the law. And I'm frankly surprised that, the general public isn't screaming holy hell about it. It just baffles me that we find ourselves again and again and again watching as people are institutionalized, as people are not equally effective communication for taking personal protective measures, that their ability to navigate disaster programs and services is the barriers for them continue to exist. I could go on. So it's not a lack of notification to Congress. It's not a lack of notification to the administrations, and I say that in plural. It is not a lack of directives that very clearly lay out the obligations. It is a lack of monitoring and enforcement. And I call on the protection and advocacy members of our family, our disability rights family, to join together with us to put an end to this very lackadaisical enforcement of 50-year-old civil rights laws.
Yes, it said in the chat, very powerful, and hit the nail on the head. It's already written. It's not being enforced, and the oversight isn't there. And you've touched on a couple of key areas and points related to planning and policy that needs to be changed within the disaster space. One area has been inclusive emergency shelters. Many of these shelters may not be equipped to accommodate the diverse needs of people with disabilities and accessible facilities. What issues have you seen related to inaccessible emergency shelters? And are there any places doing it right that have learned lessons over the last couple of years and have made improvements?
So I will say there have been there has been a lot of information provided directly through training, through technical assistance, through guides and checklists, and and still I can't tell you how many times we are contacted by people who say, I was not allowed to bring my service animal into the shelter. Thankfully, we seem to have a reckoning that has enabled people to bring their pets into shelters. And so, suddenly service animals are not turned away in quite the same way as they were, except the obligation that the shelter has for providing for that service animal is very different than their obligation for meeting the needs of pets. And so while we've made a little bit of progress on that, we've gotten some clarity from the Fair Housing Act amendments and directives that have come from that. That shelters are in fact obligated to meet the fair housing obligations. We are still on a very regular basis hearing that people are in shelters with no accessible toilet. They're in shelters with no accessible shower. They're in shelters where they don't have access to the specific dietary needs that they have. They're in sheltering situations in which they are not able to receive the personal assistance services that they need to maintain their health, their safety, their independence. And as a result, people are time and again being loaded into the back of an ambulance and shipped off to a long-term care facility. And that's happening again and again and again. In 2023, we are seeing this. There is confusion about who is responsible for the planning. There have been some additional guidelines provided by FEMA, but inadequate, definitely not enough. And again, there are no consequences for those states and local governments who are receiving those federal funds and then denying equal access, denying access to those programs and services that people need in order to be able to begin the disaster recovery process along with everyone else. And let me say, these complexities are disproportionately felt by people of color, BIPOC, people who are multiply marginalized, and disability is a part of their identity. And we then, of course, have the additional challenge on the other side, because we don't have enough affordable, accessible housing before the disaster strikes. And then we are always shocked that we have a huge number of disabled people who are either lingering in the shelters or have been moved to long-term care facilities because there's no housing for them. Every time, it's like, how did this happen? So we have a lot of work to do, and I think much of it centers on the hard work of enforcing the obligations that come with every one of those federal laws.
That's a great point. I think just
and I
remind,
was sorry, I think I was supposed to tell you where I see progress being made.
yes.
And I will say, we are seeing some progress in states that have chosen to use some of their federal emergency planning grant funds and other emergency planning funds to hire disability experts, to hire people who are identified as either disability advisors or access and functional needs advisors. And let me take a moment to point out, people get real confused that we are somehow using those terms interchangeably. When we're talking about access and functional needs, we're talking about people who have the same accessibility requirements and the same functional needs as people with disabilities, but having an access and functional need does not afford them civil rights protections. But people with disabilities are, in fact, entitled to those civil rights protections. And when we meet the needs of people with disabilities before, during, and after disasters, we actually serve the whole community, including other people who are maybe in late stages of pregnancy, or maybe don't have transportation, or experience homelessness, or a list of other access and functional needs that are making it difficult for them to be able to navigate the disaster.
Yeah, that's very helpful, that distinction, as mentioned in the chat. And just want to remind all the participants, please do provide any questions using the chat feature, and we'll start addressing those with Marcy. I'll come back to the chat question here in 1 second. You had mentioned intersectionality and individuals with disabilities often facing intersecting forms of discrimination based on other factors also, such as race, gender, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation. How can we address these unique challenges faced by individuals with disabilities who belong to marginalized communities and ensure inclusion in disability advocacy and support? And maybe if you can also address maybe some of the groups that you partner with and collaborated with to address this issue as well.
Mm-hmm. So, we are all intersectional beings. None of us is one identity only. And depending on what part of the world you're in, those intersecting identities can have either very little impact or sweeping impact. And so for people with disabilities, we are dealing with our own hierarchies. There is an unfortunate, long-standing failure in the disability community to welcome and make space for, and even more importantly, center the leadership of people of color. Black and brown, indigenous, other people of color in the disability community have been excluded from leadership roles time and again. In the US, while we are focusing on the importance of racial, anti-racial actions, for people with disabilities, the hierarchy even within our own community has resulted in the exclusion of people with mental health disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities. There are many people who are, their intersecting identities are really resulting in their exclusion. People who identify as non-binary, people who identify as transgender, LGBTQ plus, who are also people of color. and are have um, other identities, such as people who are autistic, or people who have psychosocial disabilities, a term we hear more outside of the U.S. than inside the U.S. We have a lot of work to do in our community. We have a lot of work to do with other humanitarian actors. And, as I talk about these issues with my colleagues from other parts of the world, they're not dealing with the racial discrimination issues in the disability community. They're dealing with tribal, religious, gender issues. And so, to answer your question about some of these relationships, I work very closely on a global scale with the private sector, with science and technology, with higher education, and as well as with many, many humanitarian actors. The World Institute on Disability, along with our partners from the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies and Ang Inclusiva, both the Partnership and Inclusiva are organizations that work full-time on disability and disaster. So globally, we've formed the Global Alliance for Disaster Resource Acceleration, and we're trying to close the gaps between what I refer to as the humanitarian industrial complex. There are lots and lots of big humanitarian organizations that are doing an abysmal job of including people with disabilities. So, we need to be at those tables, the humanitarian tables, as well as all of these other tables. And we really need to be working on a kind of paradigm shift that doesn't just bring people with disabilities to the table, but centers the leadership of people with disabilities. When we can get it right for people with disabilities, when we can get the intersectionality of many parts of who we are, the whole community benefits from that. And so changing the paradigm so that everybody gets that. Sorry, I'm not getting an onslaught of people. Sorry. I'm going to stop there and let you ask the next question.
Sure. Thanks, Marcy. And we got a couple of questions that have come into the chat, about three, and I know we got about 15 minutes or so left. So we had discussed emergency shelters and the needs there. There's a attendee who said, "I sincerely believe that emergency evacuation centers are well planned by the American Red Cross. Do you believe otherwise?" And I'm sure that that's a broad question, because I think I know different agencies that's working under American Red Cross do different things. So, any thoughts there? And
so let me begin by saying I am a proud member of the American Red Cross's Diversity and Inclusion Council. I am also part of the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies daily meetings that have focused on disability, COVID, and other co-occurring disasters for over 3 years now. And we've had somebody from the American Red Cross at that table virtually every day for 3 years. And we meet literally every day. We meet at 6 p.m. Eastern time on weekends, holidays. We come together every single day, and there's somebody from American Red Cross at the table almost every day. That being said, the work at the local level is not translating into accessible sheltering to the degree that it needs to be. And there seems to be a real disconnect. Local communities and states identify the shelters that are used. You know this very well, Curtis. And unfortunately, if you're not enforcing the accessibility requirements of your schools, your community centers, the other places that are being used for sheltering, the people who are opening those shelters in a disaster are dealing with that failure of accessibility. Added to that, not all shelters are run by the American Red Cross. In fact, in many states and in many local communities, the American Red Cross is not invited to provide sheltering. So there are many, many independent shelters out there that are not being held to the same obligations. And so I applaud the work of the American Red Cross, because heaven knows we've had a really rough time. They are making great progress, and they have a long way to go, as do our states and local planners.
That's great. So again, successes, but many gaps still exist there to close across the country, especially on the local level. I definitely agree with that. This question is about funding to maybe address some of these gaps. The American Rescue Plan, of course, provided billions of dollars of funding across the country. Is that a possible funding stream to build programs to provide support for individuals with disability to pre-plan for emergencies? And what's the best approach to build a solid case for funding within our community?
So, really important question. And certainly there's been a lot of work done to educate people about personal preparedness. And I certainly encourage everyone to continue to take their own personal preparedness very seriously. And it's really important to understand that in many, many situations, all the personal preparedness in the world is not going to be adequate given the circumstances of the disaster. And so our communities need to plan as though people are going to need help to evacuate. People are going to need access to their medication. People are going to need accessible places to go, and they're going to need accessible transportation to get there. We need to plan as though people are not going to show up with the specific dietary needs that they have, or that they're going to bring the equipment that they need in order to maintain their health or safety and their independence. The funding for preparedness and the you know, the new money that's on the table is also joined by the billions of dollars that go to every state every year for preparedness. And 12 years ago, when I was at FEMA, we put out guidance to the states on how they could use those preparedness grant funds to meet their obligations to provide equally effective communication access, to provide physical access, to educate, to you know, there isn't a need for new funds to do this. New funds certainly help, but there is a need to spend those funds in compliance with the Rehabilitation Act and other pertinent laws. Additional funds certainly help.
That's great. That's a great perspective. Yes, do what's on the books and use the funding that's available, and prioritize the needs of those who are on the front line of disaster impacts. We have 2 more questions. You mentioned, and this is the question. You mentioned correctly the many problems related to enforcing existing laws and regulations related to disability. Specifically, how do we go about increasing enforcement? Is it changing building codes? In many instances, a main enforcement mechanism is limited to the courts. But I guess to your point about enforcing existing laws, I guess you know how would we go about doing that? What agencies would be responsible for doing that? Any additional doors there?
Great. Yeah. So let's begin with the billions and billions of dollars that are spent on disaster recovery. There are, in addition to the building codes, there are many other obligations to the use of those funds in the rebuilding, reconstruction period. In addition to that, there are pre-disaster hazard mitigation funds, and there are the hazard mitigation funds that are 6% of every disaster funding that goes to states to essentially spend any way they want to. So a place to start would be in looking at those disaster recovery, hazard mitigation, pre and post funds, and finding out not just are they meeting the the building codes, but are they meeting the obligations under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which goes far beyond meeting building codes. And so, you know, I'm always sort of baffled that we're not sort of capitalizing on this, you know, gold mine of opportunity. And I would strongly encourage, and I'm happy to have many more conversations about this. And I bet you are as well, Curtis. And, you know, we know where some of those shortfalls are, and we need our legal partners, our legal colleagues to help us to call out those really inappropriate uses of those federal dollars.
Yes, definitely, definitely about accountability and holding these agencies responsible. We're gonna close down in about a few minutes. And again, it's been a great discussion. One question sort of related to the funding question, before I go back to you for some closing comments, is how many states are failing to access those preparedness grants? Yeah, I think yeah, part of this question is, are states just not prioritizing the money in the right direction, or are they not accessing the grants at all?
So I think, Curtis, you know this as well as I do. Oh, they are accessing all of those funds. In fact, there is a very elaborate process that is underway virtually all the time for planning for when those dollars become available, and when there is a new budget, a new federal budget, there is a 30-day notice that goes out. Warning, warning, all your money is about to be available to you. We hope you've done your planning. We hope you are ready to accept these funds that we are giving you. And then bring their priorities to FEMA, and then magically billions of dollars show up to the state administrative agent, whoever is the named recipient of those grant funds. And so in every state, you need to be working with your state administrative agent, and you need to be working with the planning team who is identifying those priorities, because that process goes on all the time. And those dollars, I think it's safe to say every one of those dollars gets spent. Curtis, would you agree?
Yes, they do get spent, and unfortunately, sometimes they not get spent and clearly where they need to be spent at. We got one more minute. Marcy, it's been a great conversation. Before we turn it back over to Disability Rights New York, and really appreciate the opportunity to participate. What is your final words on where we need to go and move forward, and how the participants can play a part of the solution as well?
Yeah. Well, thank you for this opportunity and this great discussion. And very simply, this is not about people with disabilities. This is about the whole community. And our communities are going to have much better outcomes if we, as disabled leaders, are at those tables, if we're taken seriously, if we're given the opportunity to make meaningful contributions at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, and globally as well. And I welcome every opportunity to continue this conversation with anyone who would like to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcy, for your leadership, both domestically and internationally, and your work at the United Nations and the work of the World Institute for Disabilities. So with that, I'll pass it over to Disability Rights New York. And thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, both of you, so much for such an important conversation this afternoon. And we'd like to thank all of our speakers today, as well as all of you who have joined us. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at emergencypreparedness@drny.org. This event was recorded, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel within 2 to 4 weeks. Thanks again to everyone, and we hope to see you back tomorrow for the final day of our webinar series.